Seddon Atkinson was the lorry in front of you on every British motorway through the 70s and 80s. The squared-off cab with the chrome Big A badge, in the liveries of Eddie Stobart, BRS and National Carriers. At its peak, the company employed over 1,800 workers across 2 Lancashire factories and held 1 in 6 of every heavy truck on a British road. They survived the Second World War, survived the oil crisis and the recession that wiped out half the haulage firms they'd built their business on. They adapted, retooled and kept the gates open through everything the century threw at them. And then, after 71 years of building lorries, the factory went quiet. How does a company that won the world's first International Truck of the Year simply vanish? What happened? Chapter 1. The Butcher's Sons. The story begins where so many British industrial stories do, with someone who couldn't afford to wait for permission. Robert and Herbert Seddon were the sons of a Salford butcher, not engineers, not industrialists. A butcher's boys from Lancashire, raised on a terraced street where the nearest thing to a factory floor was the cold room behind the shop counter. Herbert had served in the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War, and when he came home in the spring of 1919, he had no particular plan, just the restlessness of a young man who'd survived the skies over France and wasn't about to spend his life weighing pork chops. A family friend named Ernest Foster ran a small dairy business and needed a lorry. There was an auction, ex-military vehicles being sold off by J. Blake and Company in lots, and Herbert went along to bid on a milk truck. He came home with a Commer Carabanc instead. A passenger coach, not a goods vehicle. It was, by any measure, the wrong purchase entirely. But Mr. Seddon Sr. advanced the money on one condition. Robert would join the venture when he finished his own service. Foster and Seddon was established in Salford in April 1919, with capital of £2,500. They ran the charabanc on weekend excursions first, then branched into weekday goods haulage, then started a bus service between Swinton and Salford, which they later sold to Salford Corporation at a small profit. They held a Morris Motors agency. They reconditioned vehicles on the side. None of it was grand. All of it was practical. But Robert was the one who changed everything. He wasn't just running lorries, he was driving them, maintaining them, lying underneath them on cold mornings cursing the things that didn't work. And by the mid-1930s, he'd spotted something that no established manufacturer had bothered to address. British road haulage law in the interwar years imposed a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit on any commercial vehicle with an unladen weight over 2.5 long tons. Leyland, AEC, Albion, the big builders, all made lorries that came in well above that threshold. Their trucks were strong, reliable and slow. Robert Seddon, sitting at his kitchen table in 1937, drew up a different kind of machine, a 6-ton payload forward-controlled diesel chassis powered by a Perkins P6 6-cylinder indirect injection engine, designed so that the whole vehicle came in just under 2.5 tons unladen. The arithmetic was elegant. His lorry could carry 6 tons of freight at 30 miles per hour, legally, while heavier competitors crawled along at 20. He showed it at the Scottish Motor Show at Kelvin Hall, Glasgow, in 1938. It wasn't beautiful. It didn't need to be. It was cheap to buy, cheap to run on diesel, and 50% faster than anything else carrying the same load. For the small haulage operators who made up the backbone of British road transport, it was an immediate proposition. And then an accident of scale saved the company before it had properly begun. When the Second World War broke out, the Ministry of Supply requisitioned the production lines of the big manufacturers, Leyland, AEC, Albion, for military contracts. Foster and Seddon, being too small to matter, was left alone. The firm kept building civil chassis through the entire war, supplying the hauliers who were keeping wartime Britain fed and fueled. It was, quite literally, too insignificant to nationalise. That insignificance would turn out to be the foundation of everything that followed. Chapter 2. Woodstock. By 1946, the Pendleton premises couldn't keep up. Robert Seddon's operation was building 1, sometimes 2, vehicles a week in a space that had never been designed for manufacturing at any scale. The order book was growing, the post-war haulage boom was gathering speed, and a former shadow factory had come up for sale. The Woodstock works sat at Newhay in Shore, on the edge of Oldham, a wartime precision aero-engineering facility that the government no longer needed. The company bought it for around £300,000. On the 8th of November 1946, Alderman Sterling J. Marron, the mayor of Oldham, performed the opening ceremony and took possession of the first vehicle off the new line on behalf of Oldham Corporation. Robert Seddon, addressing the assembled distributors that day, said something that would echo for decades. Oldham had an engineering tradition fostered by generations of craftsmen. The presence of skilled engineers was one of the factors in the company's choice of these premises. It was a deliberate alignment. Oldham was a cotton town. Its mills were already thinning, and skilled hands were looking for work that wouldn't vanish. Seddon gave them that work. Production jumped from 2 vehicles a week to 10 or more. The company became Seddon Motors, then Seddon Diesel Vehicles from 1951, when it floated with £400,000 in issued capital. The Mark V became the best-selling post-war haulage chassis. By 1954, Seddon was pioneering glass fibre cabs through its Pennine Coachcraft subsidiary, lighter, cheaper, a step ahead of the pressed steel norm. By 1961, Woodstock employed 450 people. Harold Redmond had joined the brothers back in April 1930, when the firm's entire capital stood at £7,126. He rose through the ranks with the quiet competence of a man who understood both the engineering and the books. By 1964, Redmond was chairman and managing director. His 2 sons sat on the board, Geoffrey as financial director, David as engineering director. Robert Seddon had held the chairmanship until 1962, Herbert until 1964. The company was visibly what it had always been, a family concern, now with a protégé's family running it. Sales for the year to June 1968 reached £9 million. Output at Woodstock was around 2,200 chassis a year. Export markets included New Zealand, Ireland, Ghana, Qatar, and Fiji. The Pennine 7 bus chassis sold steadily. Seddon Diesel Vehicles was, by the late 1960s, a small but profitable public company with a loyal customer base, a well-equipped factory, and a workforce that knew its craft. Then it did something extraordinary. It picked a fight with a bigger rival, and won. Atkinson Vehicles of Walton-le-Dale, Preston, was the famous Big A of British heavy haulage. Founded in 1907 by Edward and Henry Birch Atkinson, reformed in 1933 under London garage owner W.G. Allen, the firm had built its reputation on Gardner-engined, Kirkstall-axled heavyweights, with the proud Knight of the Road radiator badge. To the hauliers of Lancashire, Cumbria, and the North East, the Big A meant quality, reliability, and a certain stubborn British integrity. Atkinson was the bigger company, the more famous brand, the truck that drivers asked for by name. By 1969, Atkinson was ailing. ERF and Foden opened a bidding war. Then Seddon came in late, backed unexpectedly by Leyland, which held a 15% stake in Atkinson and broke its silence to support the Oldham bid. Tony Allen, Atkinson's chairman, was publicly furious. He told the press he would not be prepared to work in any joint interest with Seddon. Loyal Atkinson customers bought shares to try to block the takeover. The shop floor at Walton-le-Dale considered itself the superior operation by a considerable margin. It didn't matter. By November 1970, Seddon held 67%. The merger was formalised on the 1st of January 1971. Seddon Atkinson Vehicles Limited was born. The Oldham underdog had swallowed the Preston heavyweight, and in doing so, it had acquired the most respected badge in British trucking. Chapter 3. The Workhorse. For the first 4 years, the merger changed very little on the ground. Oldham kept building Seddons. Walton-le-Dale kept building Atkinsons. 2 factories, 2 product lines, 2 workforces who regarded each other with the polite suspicion of rival football teams sharing a dressing room. The unifying moment came in 1975 with the launch of the new range. The cab was designed by Ogle Design, the same consultancy that had styled the Reliant Robin and the Bond Bug, and built on motor panels pressings at Coventry. It was a steel tilt cab, squared off and functional, with a family face that badged across 3 models, the 200 at 16 tons rigid, the 300 as a 24-ton 3-axle rigid, and the 400 as a 32-ton tractor unit. The 200 and 300 were Seddon-derived, running International Harvester D-Series engines. The 400 was mostly Atkinson under the new skin, the heavy haulage DNA of Walton-le-Dale in a modern cab. The 400 series hit the market at exactly the right moment. British haulage was consolidating. The national carriers, BRS, national carriers, the big fleet operators, needed reliable, economical tractors in volume. The 400 gave them precisely that: Cummins NHC 250 and later big cam E290 engines, Rolls-Royce Eagle 265L, Gardner 6LXB and 8LXB for the operators who wouldn't touch anything else. Power options ran up to 320 horsepower. Within 2 years, the 400 had captured 17.5% of the British over 28-ton market. 1 in every 6 heavy trucks on a British motorway carried the Seddon Atkinson badge. The customer list read like a roll call of post-war British industry: BRS, National Carriers, ICI, which uniquely specified the 400 with the fully automatic ZF Transmatic gearbox, the only fleet in the country running that transmission. Esso Petroleum, Eddie Stobart of Carlisle, whose green and red livery was just beginning to become a motorway fixture. W&J, Riding of Longridge, Killingbeck, Meeks of Kirby, James Nuttall of Hollingwood, a local firm, minutes from the Woodstock gates. Municipal fire brigades and refuse fleets ordered them by the dozen. Cleveland Fire Brigade's Incident Support Unit, chassis F886KRG, was built on a Seddon Atkinson brewery dray and would serve into the 2000s. Inside Woodstock, the rhythm of production settled into the pattern that workers would remember for the rest of their lives. The assembly line ran through a building that still carried the proportions of its wartime origins: high ceilings designed for aero-engineering, concrete floors that shook when the overhead cranes swung chassis from one station to the next. The smell was oil and hot metal and the particular chemical sharpness of fresh paint in the finishing bay. Roughly 40 workers still bussed in daily from Salford on the company coach, the last physical trace of the original Pendleton base, a daily commute that connected the factory's present to its past. The Big A badge, meanwhile, had taken on a life of its own. Atkinson loyalists, the hauliers who'd run the Knight of the Road badged heavyweights for decades, bought the new 400 series but refitted the old Atkinson circle to the chrome grille, covering the Seddon Atkinson script with the badge they'd grown up trusting. It was a small revolt, quiet and persistent, and management eventually acknowledged it by restoring the Atkinson circle to the 401 grille in the early 1980s. The Big A meant something that transcended corporate mergers. It was a mark of belonging, a statement that you ran proper trucks, built in Lancashire, by men who knew what they were doing. By the late 1970s, the combined Seddon Atkinson workforce, across Oldham and Walton-le-Dale, had reached approximately 1,836. The Pennine 7 bus chassis was still selling. Export markets were steady. And then, in January 1977, something happened that would become the single brightest point in the company's entire history. Chapter 4. The Summit. The award was the brainchild of 2 men, Pat Kennett, the first editor of Truck magazine, and Andrew Frankel, its publisher. They'd decided that the commercial vehicle industry deserved its own equivalent of Car of the Year, a prize judged by an international jury of transport journalists, recognizing the best new truck launched on the European market. They called it International Truck of the Year. Nobody had done it before, and the first truck to win it, in January 1977, was the Seddon Atkinson 200, an Oldham-built lorry. Not a Volvo, not a Mercedes, not a Scania. A truck designed in Lancashire, assembled at Woodstock, carrying a badge that had existed for barely 6 years. The company's response was an advert that became instantly notorious in the trade press. "We'd like to thank British Leyland, Chrysler, Bedford, Fiat and Mercedes for making it all possible." It was cocky. It was funny. It was the sound of a company that believed it had arrived. And it had. For a moment, a brief, shining window in the late 1970s, Seddon Atkinson was the most respected name in European trucking. The 400 owned the motorways. The workforce was at its peak. The Woodstock factory hummed 6 days a week. But the 400's motor panels cab had a problem that no award could fix. The pressed steel corroded. Not slowly, not gracefully, but visibly and persistently. Rust blooming through the paintwork within a few years of delivery, eating through door skins and cab corners, turning a truck that was mechanically sound into something that looked 10 years older than it was. Hauliers noticed. Drivers noticed. The rust became a talking point in transport cafes and at haulage depots across the country. The 400 was still a good truck underneath, But the cab was rotting around it, and in a market where operators kept their vehicles for 7, 8, 10 years, that mattered enormously. And 3 years before the award, before the advert, before the peak, something else had happened. Something that wouldn't reveal its full consequences for almost a decade. In 1974, International Harvester of Chicago had bought Seddon Atkinson outright. Harold Redmond's company, the company that Robert Seddon had sketched on a kitchen table, that Herbert had started with a carabank and a dairy farmer, now belonged to one of the largest industrial conglomerates on Earth. The trap was closing. Nobody at Woodstock could see it yet. Chapter 5. The American Father. International Harvester paid around £10 million for Seddon Atkinson in 1974. The deal was handled through IH Canada, a routing that Commercial Motors' Bill Callahan probed at the press conference, asking whether the Canadian intermediary was a SOP to some British objections to more American involvement in the truck industry. Nobody denied it outright. The truth was straightforward enough. IH wanted a European foothold, and Harold Redmond wanted capital. Harry Mazurek, president of IH's International Truck Division, promised the British operation access to a $10 million component expansion program and American engine production. W.E. Callahan, no relation to the journalist, fronted the deal for IH. Mr. Doyle and Norman Smith joined the Seddon Atkinson board. Redmond stayed on as chairman and managing director, the continuity figure reassuring a workforce that had just discovered their employer was now a division of a $30 billion Chicago conglomerate. IH's D358 engines duly arrived in the 200 and 300 models. American capital funded modest improvements. For 5 years, the arrangement looked reasonable. A small British truck builder with access to a giant's supply chain. The workforce didn't shrink. The product didn't suffer. Oldham kept building. Then International Harvester began to destroy itself. In 1977, IH hired Archie McCardle from Xerox as chief executive. Salary $460,000, signing bonus $1.5 million, plus a $1.8 million loan at 6%. McCardle's mandate was to modernize the conglomerate. His method was confrontation. He picked a fight with the United Auto Workers over compulsory overtime, and on the 1st of November 1979, the UAW walked out. The strike lasted 172 days, the longest in International Harvester's history, and at the time, the 4th longest in the entire history of the UAW. IH lost $479.4 million during those months alone. 3 months into the strike, President Carter imposed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union in response to the invasion of Afghanistan. The American farm equipment market, IH's core business, collapsed almost overnight. The company lost $397 million in fiscal 1980, another $96 million in the first quarter of 1981. IH defaulted on its short-term loans and was forced to renegotiate $4.15 billion of debt with 200 lenders to avoid bankruptcy. McCardle was fired on the 3rd of May 1982. The combined losses for fiscal 1980, 1981 and 1982 reached $2.4 billion, the largest 3-year loss any American company had ever recorded. For the workers at Woodstock, the catastrophe arrived on the 5th of February 1981. Seddon Atkinson announced the closure of the Walton-le-Dale plant, 470 jobs gone in Preston, 338 redundancies at Oldham, 808 people in total. Stan Thorne, Labour MP for Preston South, raised it as an emergency adjournment debate in the House of Commons that afternoon. The last true Atkinson, a Defender 8-wheel rigid, chassis number FC29941, registered KVT 604P, was driven away to G and B Macready of Newcastle-under-Lyme. By the end of 1981, the Walton-le-Dale gates were shut for good. The Big A was now an Oldham-only operation, inside a parent company hemorrhaging money at a rate that made survival unlikely. The 1980s recession was finishing off the small fleet hauliers who had been Seddon Atkinson's most loyal customers, the family firms that had run Big A trucks for 30 years, who knew the service manager by name, who wouldn't buy anything else. One by one, they were going under, and IH, drowning in its own debt, had nothing left to invest. Harold Redmond's reasonable decision in 1974 to sell to a conglomerate that could fund growth had delivered the company into the hands of an owner that was now fighting for its own life, with no interest in a small truck factory in Lancashire beyond what it could extract or offload. Chapter 6. The Pound Note and the Funeral Director. The exit, when it came, was almost absurd in its symbolism. In February 1983, International Harvester sold Seddon Atkinson to ENASA, Empresa Nacional de Autocamiones, the Spanish state holding behind the Pegaso truck brand, for a reported price of £1, a symbolic pound. Not as a market valuation, not as a reflection of what the Woodstock factory and its workforce and its customer base and its tooling were actually worth, but as compensation. IH had promised ENASA a joint venture engine factory in Spain. The factory was never built. Seddon Atkinson was the apology. A British truck manufacturer, the builder of the first ever International Truck of the Year, a company with 70 years of continuous production, a workforce that had survived 2 world wars and a global recession, traded for the price of a morning newspaper. ENASA's own corporate history is unambiguous about the figure. £1. ENASA's logic was European market access. Spain was about to join the European Economic Community. It would formally accede in 1985, and Pegaso needed a UK badge and a dealer network. The investment in Oldham was modest: rust protection improvements to the cab, a 1986 renaming of the range to 211, 311, and 411 with Ogle aerodynamic tweaks, and the Perkins phaser engine. Market share had fallen to roughly 5% of the British truck market. The workforce had been cut to a fraction of its 1981 peak, but the factory still ran. Trucks still left the Woodstock gates with the big A on the grille. The real ENASA-era event was the Strato, launched in September 1988. ENASA, DAF and Seddon Atkinson formed a joint venture called CabTech to build a shared cab design. The cab would sit on 3 different trucks: the Pegaso Trona, the DAF 95 and the Seddon Atkinson Strato. It was manufactured in Madrid and shipped to Oldham 6 at a time on flatbed trailers, a journey of over 1,000 miles, so that a British lorry could be assembled with a Spanish cab over a British chassis with American running gear. The Strato came in 3 heights: day cab, sleeper, and the high-roofed Strato Cruiser, which was, in all meaningful respects, a DAF 95 space cab in different paint. Loyal customers bought them. Commercial Motors road tests rated them solid if unremarkable. W&J Riding of Longridge ran them. Esso ran them. ICI ran them. The big A still meant something to the operators who'd been buying Atkinsons and Seddons for decades, but for the first time since Robert Seddon's kitchen table drawing in 1937, the company's identity rested on a cab it had not designed, not built, and did not control. The centre of gravity had left Lancashire. The engineering was Spanish. The engines were American. The transmission was American. What remained at Oldham was assembly, the bolting together of components that arrived from elsewhere, and a chrome badge. Then, in May 1990, a joint takeover bid for ENASA by Daimler-Benz and MAN was blocked by the West German cartel office. On the 13th of September 1990, the Spanish state holding ENE sold ENASA to Iveco, Industrial Vehicles Corporation, part of the Fiat Group, by second-round tender. Seddon Atkinson, as an ENASA subsidiary, went with it. The Oldham factory had changed hands for the 3rd time in 16 years. Chicago, Madrid, Turin, each owner further from Woodstock than the last, each one needing Seddon Atkinson a little less than the one before. Chapter 7. The Long Silence. The Iveco years were not a decline. They were an evaporation. The Strato 2, from late 1993, dropped Perkins engines and standardized on Cummins, L10, then M11, then the 14-litre. The CabTech cab was replaced by the Iveco Eurotech cabin. The 1996 Strato TC was a lighter version of the same structure. By the late 1990s, the Seddon Atkinson catalogue had narrowed to a specialist municipal range: the Euromover low-entry refuse truck, the Pacer skip loader and construction chassis, and the continuing Strato for tanker and tractor work. Seddon Atkinson had become what Iveco needed it to be, a dust cart brand. The big A was a chrome circle on a grille that was otherwise pure Italian. Inside the factory, the logic was thinning by the year. The Strato shared more than 80% of its components with the Iveco Eurotech and Eurotracker. Output was a few hundred units annually. The assembly work that remained at Oldham could have been done anywhere. and Iveco had a factory in Madrid that could do it cheaper. In 2002, the announcement came. Production would move to the Pegaso plant at Madrid Barajas. The Woodstock factory would close. The shutdown took until late 2004. Around 200 jobs went, roughly 155 production roles and 45 in sales and service. One worker, offered his job in Madrid, turned it down. He'd worked at the Oldham factory for 35 years. He'd later write on an internet forum that they were the best years of his life, that the trucks were built by men, not robots. He wasn't going to Spain. The administrative offices stayed open until the end of 2006. Then those closed too. Phil Wallace, the Labour MP for Oldham East and Saddleworth, the constituency that contained Newey, was in office throughout. So was Michael Meacher, MP for Oldham West and Royton. Neither raised the closure in the Commons. 200 jobs, in a town that had already lost its cotton mills, its textile industry, and most of its 20th century industrial base, didn't generate the political theatre that 808 redundancies had produced in 1981 when Stan Thorne demanded an emergency debate. The loss was too small to make news, which is itself a measure of how much had already been taken before this final taking arrived. The brand limped on as a badge. The M5 Pacer, with a new Iveco cab, launched at the CIWM exhibition at Torbay in 2006. National sales manager Kevin Crowder fronted the press. 13 distributors sold the range across the UK. Annual registrations never recovered. In its final full year, Seddon Atkinson registered just 284 vehicles. In late 2009, an Iveco spokesman confirmed the end. The cost of designing a new, low-entry refuse cab and meeting Euro 4 emissions type approval was, he said, prohibitive, particularly as Seddon Atkinson registered just 284 units last year. There was no press conference, no public statement. Dealers learned by letter, sent the previous March. In December 2009, 71 years after Robert Seddon's kitchen table sketch, the Big A was retired. Chapter 8. What the Silence Holds. The Woodstock factory at Newey Shore still stands. The buildings haven't been demolished. They haven't been redeveloped into flats or a retail park. The site is reportedly owned by a local family, the Howarths, according to those who've made the pilgrimage, and let as light industrial units to small engineering and storage businesses. There is no plaque on the gate, no museum, no commemorative marker of any kind. A factory that once employed over 1,000 people and built the first international truck of the year sits in quiet suburban anonymity, its purpose forgotten by everyone who hasn't specifically gone looking for it. The Walton-le-Dale site in Preston, where Atkinson had built lorries since 1907, was demolished entirely. It's an edge-of-town shopping centre now. Heritage survives where enthusiasts carry it. The British Commercial Vehicle Museum at Leyland holds Atkinson and Seddon examples. Restored 400 series tractors in National Carriers Green, BRS Blue, and Eddie Stobart livery appear at the Trans-Pennine Run on August bank holiday weekends, and at Donington Park commercial vehicle shows. Polished to a mirror, finished by men who remember when those trucks were just the tools they drove to work. Pat Kennett's 1978 book, Seddon Atkinson, number 3 in the Patrick Stevens World Truck series, remains the standard reference. Online, the community clusters on the TruckNet UK forum, the Atkinson and Seddon Heritage Clubs, and Facebook groups where W and J Riding's Strato fleet is documented with the care of a family album. Every chassis number recorded, every photograph preserved. For Oldham, the Woodstock closure was one loss among many. The borough remains one of the most deprived in England. 9 of its 20 wards fall within the most deprived 10% on the index of multiple deprivation. The cotton mills went first, then the engineering, then the last truck factory. The Iveco S-Way that rolls off the line at Madrid today carries, somewhere deep in its component engineering, a lineage that traces through Pegaso to the British acquisition of 1983, a thin, almost invisible thread connecting a Spanish-built truck to a kitchen table in Salford, where a butcher's son once drew a lorry that was too light to be slow and too small to be noticed by the ministry men. 3 foreign owners in 16 years. Chicago, Madrid, Turin. Each one replaced something: the engineering, the cab, the chassis, the workforce, the meaning. Until the Big A was a chrome badge on a refuse truck that could have been built anywhere, by anyone. for a brand that existed only because nobody had yet signed the letter that retired it. Somebody signed it in December 2009. The silence at New.1 has held ever since.